You brighten up a little.
Who, me? Well, it's because my shirt's
No,
yellow.
it's your personality.
Oh.
We're live and direct. So while I'm finding my place, let me talk to you about some current events happening about. We're broadcasting on June 5th, 2013. The media has been advertising an event put on by the Black Student Union, an unveiling of a Wiley Griffin Memorial Historical Monument in the Eugene Masonic Cemetery. And that's on Friday, June 7th, 5 o'clock in the Masonic Cemetery around Hope Abbey, and also near where Wiley Griffin is buried. Wiley Griffin, if you don't know by now, was the first historically recognized African-American resident of Eugene. Not the first actual one, just the first one mentioned in the historical record.
What time is it?
By name, 5 o'clock. And here we go. Let's see. I think I ended on the Million Man March last time, right? All right. So that's history. So we'll move on. You should also know that my engineer just handed me this. This class, the African American Experience, repeats this summer in its entirety. That is fall, winter, and spring term. Monday through Thursday nights at 10 p.m. starting June 17th and running through September 23rd. Also on the Lane TV website, we will also have all the YouTube links for all the classes, i.e. shows.
10 p.m.
10 p.m. This is Comcast 23 and Charter 9, and all episodes are also on YouTube, too.
Those are worth looking at again.
I would say they would be. But
Not that there's very much information in there.
no, probably no information there at all worth knowing about. But so in the challenge of doing the 13 years of the 21st century so far and compressing them into an hour and a half and, nearly 2 hours, plus giving you time to do your, basically give you the preferred answers on the midterm, because the midterm is basically comprehensive, so the final is the first half of the final is the midterm. So, and the rest of it, which, without necessarily giving it away, is might require some research, but we'll be covering that too. So I might be going rather fast, but hey, there we go.
Don't forget to take time to editorialize.
I won't. Don't worry. Here's an editorialization. One of your classmates asked me, was I for or against weed? And I'm going, look, it was a legal drug, as we discussed before. It was a legal drug. The use of that drug in human culture goes back 10,000 years.
That's in today's paper, right?
That's in today's paper, right. So African Americans get arrested more times for marijuana than whites do, despite using the drug at basically the same rates. All right, so 14% for African Americans, 12% for whites, which is, adjusting for population, there are more whites smoking. So, okay, so here's the piece. If you understand what I was talking about with the school to prison pipeline, depending on when you get arrested, if you progress further into addiction, because you're black, it is likely that you won't get drug treatment and you'll have a drug offense on your record. Now, if it's only marijuana and you're in a medical marijuana state and you have a card, you have some mitigating factors. But what often happens, and I've seen the pattern happen in this state, in this town, is that once a black kid gets arrested for pot, that puts them in the juvenile justice system, and it becomes a free fall into the adult system without treatment, right? So then you get hooked up in that whole prison to school, prison industrial complex, new Jim Crow nexus, right? So yeah, you may like smoking weed, and only if you're a football player will that weed use be excused, and that could be a barrier to further employment.
We smoke it all doesn't always work.
Yeah, and
Else.
depending on how you're, yeah, so it's like, that's not my opinion about, whether weed is good or not. It's like, no, I'm a drug counselor, so it's not that I'm against it. It's like, I'm against addiction. I'm also against people being unfairly targeted and having their life screwed up because, look, you could avoid this trap. It's really easy. It's set up there for a reason. Okay, they made marijuana illegal because black people and Mexicans were smoking it, even though there were way more whites smoking it. So there's a racial element in there. So knowing that their trap is there is the first step to avoiding it. Okay? If it's illegal, be invisible. If you're invisible, no one sees you. Very simple. Elementary street wisdom. That's all I'm going to say. Don't get strung out. The state of Black America. There's a lot of stuff, and I've basically included like 4 links. I've actually viewed some of this on cable. The State of Black America is a report that's done by the National Urban League. And because of the origins of the National Urban League, they focus mostly on economics. So the first link is actually the National Urban League site itself, then the GRIO, which is a black-oriented website owned by the Washington Post, and then Huffington Post, basically. So, and there's also, I think I have Michelle Martin's show, Tell Me More on NPR, that talks about it. So, State of Black America, 2013 report. So in terms of education, high school completion gap is closed by 57 percentage points. That is between blacks and whites, using whites as the standard in terms of who's graduating the most. There are more than triple the number of blacks enrolled in college than, say, relatively from 1963. So for every college graduate in 1963, there are now 5. So the reason this comparison to 1963, 50 years ago, with the second March on Washington, Martin Luther King's Bounce Check speech, where he's talking about economics, not the I Have a Dream speech, let's call it what he called it, the Bounce Check speech. He's squarely talking about economic disparity, and that poverty is not an accident, it's a form of violence. Fanon would say socio-structural violence, form of institutionalism, right? So part of getting out of that economic trap is going on with your education and having it be marketable, whoever you are, but particularly, as is the African American experience, you want to be more threatening. And they're definitely threatened by intelligence, especially if you use vocabulary, like you're a college graduate. That's scary. They don't want intelligent black folks. They want you ignorant. Don't be ignorant. Right? Standard of living. The percentage of blacks living in poverty has declined by 23 points. The percentage of black children living in poverty has fallen by 22 points. The percentage of blacks who own their home has increased by 14 points. This is all encouraging news. Now, of course, the downside. In the past 50 years, the black-white income gap has only closed by 7 points, now at 60%. The unemployment rate gap has closed by 6 points, now at 52%. So as in 1963, the black-white unemployment ratio still is about 2 to 1, regardless of education, gender, region of the country, or income level.
That's scary.
Okay? So part of the piece, if you read Claude Anderson's book, Powernomics, where he talks about some of the strategies that you can use to basically understand how money works and how economic power works, too. Michelle Martin's show, Tell Me More. This is a partial transcript. The link to the full transcript is up there. First, we are focusing on the economic progress or lack thereof facing African Americans. This year marks the 50th anniversary of a number of important dates in civil rights history, including the March on Washington, and what she's using the mainstream reference, I Have a Dream speech. Today, the National Urban League releases the State of Black America, Redeem the Dream. That is that group's report on the economic progress of African Americans over the last 5 decades, and it finds that African Americans have made significant gains in access to education, but have not closed the gap with white Americans in attaining economic power, where economics is a form of power. So you can read that more. I'm not going to really go into that, but I'm going to look at some factors, some news events, whether you may or may not have been aware of this, but looking at some other things in terms of economic power. There are still economic inequities, but we also experience type 1. So the reason I'm referring to this as a lynching, now, so first of all, where the term lynching came from. Captain John Lynch, a Virginia person who was essentially, even though he's called the captain, he, as a civilian, there was no police force in Virginia, so they basically got a posse together and went after escaped criminals, or criminals who were terrorizing, and they hung them on the spot. Now, this was white people that he was going after mostly. The term becoming applied to terrorism by black people after the Reconstruction and in the Civil Rights era became later. So John Lynch is where lynching came from. The term lynching now has become racialized in terms of most of the people, and we basically talk about for that online website or coffee table book, Without Sanctuary, where it's a collection of lynching photography.
Was this in the late 1800s?
Let's see, Lynch was 18th century, Virginia.
1700s.
Yeah, 1700s. Yeah. So James Byrd. So lynching is torture to death, most often with a racial motivation, even though it didn't start out that way. Jasper, Texas is still a town living as if it were segregated in the 19th century. James Byrd hitched a ride with people he knew from town, Sean Allen Barry, Lawrence Russell Brewer, and John William King. On June 7th, he accepted a ride from 3 men who beat him behind a convenience store, chained him by the ankles to their pickup truck, stripped him naked, and dragged him for 3 miles. Although Brewer said that Bird's throat had been slashed before he was dragged, like, okay, that makes it better because he's theoretically dead. No. Forensic evidence suggests that he had been attempting to keep his head up, and an autopsy suggested Byrd was alive. So much of the dragging died after his right arm and head were severed when his body hit a culvert. His body caught a sewage drain on the side of the road, resulting in his decapitation. King, Barry, and Brewer dumped their victims' mutilated remains in the town's black cemetery and then went to a barbecue. A wrench inscribed with Barry was found within the area, along with a lighter that had possum written on it, which is King's prison nickname. The next morning, Bird's limbs were scattered across a very little-used road. Police found 75 places littered with his remains. State law enforcement officials, along with Jasper's District Attorney Guy James Gray and Assistant Pat Hardy, determined that since King and Brewer were well-known white supremacists, the murder was a hate crime, and decided to bring in the FBI's less than 24 hours after the discovery of his remains, Mr. Bird's remains. One of his murderers had a tattoo. John King had a tattoo depicting a black man hanging from a tree, and other tattoos such as Nazi symbols, the words Aryan Pride, and a patch for the Confederate Knights of America, a gang of white supremacist inmates, which is basically a reference to saying that they're related to the Klan, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. In a jailhouse letter to Brewer, which was intercepted by jail officials, King expressed pride in the crime and said he realized he might have to die for committing it. Regardless of the outcome of this, we have made history. Death before dishonor, Sieg Heil. An officer investigating the case also testified that witnesses said King referenced the Turner Diaries after beating Byrd. Not that you're necessarily going to be familiar with white supremacist literature. The Turner Diaries was a book written by an OSU, Oregon State University physics professor, basically talking about a racial holy war. So, Brewer and King were sentenced to death. Berry received life in prison. The men who killed James Byrd were the first white men sentenced to death for killing a black man since slavery in Texas.
What was the subject that the professor taught?
Physics.
Oh, physics.
Among other things.
Oh, okay.
Physics. While I was a student at OSU, I actually, has anybody done an analysis of his grading patterns?
Probably not. If they've been done, they've been buried.
Yeah. Well, he's dead now, but whatever.
You can't make this shit up.
Yeah, I know, you can't, but, so.
Did you?
Huh?
I know you did.
What? My grading patterns?
No, his grading patterns.
Oh, well, sure, to the degree that, there were still, he was teaching there, I think in the 80s or 90s, and there were some black graduate students who said, he was clearly, his racial views were clear in his grading patterns, but, what are you gonna do?
Mm-hmm.
OSU hired him, so, this was, one of the institutions, when I talk about the Ku Klux Klan, while the Eugene Klan was run out of the University of Oregon, they didn't have a student clavern. OSU had a student clavern as well as, a Ku Klux Klan, probably with members of the faculty. So they just followed an Oregon tradition. Well, a Southern tradition anyway, to be fair. So, the point I want to make about this, okay, obviously in Texas, this is Texas, right? So these are not the first white men who have killed black men in Texas, right? But they're the first ones sentenced to death for killing a black man since slavery. Okay? Which, of course, killing a black man in Texas didn't used to be a crime, but okay, so the white man who was hung, I believe, killed a slave, was not convicted of the murder of a human being, but destroying someone else's property. Right? So, of course, if you own the slave and you kill the slave, as if you didn't know this from Django Unchained, this is a reality.
But that wasn't the ruling in this case, was it? No, he killed the slave. Basically, the slave owner would have been within his right to kill his own slave if he wanted. This guy was treated like by Texas law like he was a horse thief. You get hung for destroying somebody else's property. So this, there are other white men who had been killed, or who had killed black men who weren't necessarily either arrested, or if they were arrested and tried and convicted, if that happened. Because, with Emmett Till, they admitted they did it, and they got acquitted. So, again, this is the South in terms of looking at, the patterns of, how far have we come? Has there been progress? The James Byrd, referring to it as a lynching, well, this had all the features. His killers were known to him, and theoretically they didn't have beef before because he accepted a ride with him. Now, I'm a drug counselor, right? So he was drunk. So I don't blame the victim, but I point out to you that if you get drunk enough so that you're in a blackout state, you are trusting your life to the goodwill of strangers because you can't remember what's happening. And why would you trust certain people, male or female?
You don't even have to be blacked out.
You don't even have to be blacked out. You can just be incapacitated.
Yeah, no.
So my basic thing, being from Los Angeles, I don't trust people. So I never get to that state where I don't know what's going on around me.
He might not have a choice.
He might not have a choice, but he did get drunk. So I'm just pointing out, look, don't get that loaded so that you aren't aware of your surroundings. Okay? Don't. Because that is definitely a key to not only preventing crime, but also not becoming a victim of crime either. Keep yourself safe. Stay conscious.
Stay in control of yourself.
Stay in control of yourself at all times. So this is Mr. Bird, and this is the chain admitted in court.
I remember that one. That was.
Yeah. So,
What year was it?
this was, murders happened in 98. The trial basically stretched into 99 and 2000. So that's why I opened this, in memory, being around during that time, it kind of shocked the nation. Wow, the 21st century, I thought we were beyond this, right? Well, apparently not. So, in terms of studying the election process, the 2000 selection. The 2000 presidential election did not really hinge on Al Gore losing Florida because of hanging chads, even though that's the popular story and popular theory. Okay? If you really wanted to steal an election, would you leave the chance of winning by only a few hundred votes? Probably not. You wouldn't. If you were willing to indulge in type 5 tactics, that is, covert institutional, what would you do?
Go to the Supreme Court.
Before you don't want it to get to the Supreme Court, but if you do, yes, the Supreme Court deck was stacked already by the previous administration, sure. But I'm talking about the electoral process itself. Now, I'm not talking, I fought in middle school for the 18-year-old vote, which you now enjoy. The logic being, wait, if I'm old enough to die in Vietnam, why should I not be able to vote until 21? That's whack. So we, sign petitions carry petitions as middle schoolers. And you now enjoy the 18-year-old vote. That came out under Nixon. That Nixon who started doing illegalities in Watergate. In any case, all I'm saying is, I have voted in all but one election since then. It doesn't matter whether you think voting's an illusion or not. Saying your voice does matter. It does matter. But I also need to understand what could happen at another level and guard against it. So, if you are willing to engage in type 5 tactics, okay, so type 5 is a form of institutionalism where it's illegal to do it, but in order to catch them, you have to have proof that meets the standard of proof and the rules of evidence so that you could bring an action later in court. So, not all racists are stupid. Understand that. Okay? The Turner Diaries, written by William Luther Pierce under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald, was trained as a physicist. He worked at OSU for 3 years and was inspired by events he saw there at OSU, that is, the civil rights and the Vietnam anti-war movements in the 60s. And that's seeing that campus unrest, that campus activism, while he was at OSU, inspired him to write this racist manifesto that also inspired not only the James Byrd lynching, but Timothy McVeigh bombing the McMurrow building in Oklahoma City. Okay? He saw the civil rights movement as a threat to the white race. Also, he believed the anti-war movement to be communist-inspired and led primarily by Jews. So, again, when you see these tropes, these memes, these metaphors, look, this isn't a stupid person, even though he might believe in things that are irrational and not factual. This is why, in case
you wanted to know the answer to the Judy Katz question on the midterm, which we will be discussing the midterm later. This is why some theorists think of racism as a form of schizophrenia, because you believe stuff that's not true, not factually true, and demonstrably true. It becomes a core system in your beliefs.
Communist, when I think of communist inspired, I also think of the relationship between some white supremacist groups.
Mm-hmm.
Is that far off?
No, it isn't. Yeah. And it, depending on how you define white supremacy, because there's different, there's a continuum, right? So this type of brand of white supremacists doesn't like communists because communists believe in equality, that everybody's equal, regardless of race. Okay? But Marx himself still believes that whites are superior to people of color. He believed that, even though he said, okay, these Native Americans that are written about by this Frenchman, that's where his core beliefs in socialism comes from, observing Iroquois Six Nation. Oh, everybody owns the land. Well, right, we don't believe in ownership of land, period. Yeah, we believe in having women as part of the government. We believe that every adult is a citizen within our government, and it's the women that decide whether we go to war or not. And they make the chiefs, representative government. Okay, you want to call that socialism, fine, but that's not what we call it. We just call that common sense. The women are the majority. They're the ones that bear the future nations. You should basically have a civilization based on protecting women and children first. Like the Titanic. Otherwise you sink your civilization if you don't do that. That's common sense. So those became kind of the core beliefs of socialism, but he basically, had a different view about, the role of people of color within that particular piece. So, white supremacists in that sense, but not virulent anti-racist.
There's no color on that boat.
Yeah. So the Turner Diaries inspired the second largest act of terrorism on U.S. soil before 9/11. Oklahoma City. So in terms of looking at timelines, as a sports star, as an athlete, not that Michael Jordan is like a civil rights activist, because in his home state of Carolina, he didn't really know about the Wilmington 10, which is basically a group of people becoming arrested for, wanting black studies in their high school, as well as, Martin Luther King holiday. He announced his position as partner and president of basketball operations of the Wizards, Washington Wizards. January 17th, 46,000 protesters rallied in a march in the state capitol in Columbia, South Carolina, to protest the Confederate battle flag flying atop the State House dome. NAACP Chair Kwesi Mfume, the main speaker of the event, called it the greatest civil rights rally since the 60s. Louis Farrakhan announces an end to the 25-year-long rift between the Nation of Islam and the Muslim American Society, headed by Wallace Dean Muhammad, who was the son of Elijah Muhammad. The group split in 1975 following the death of Elijah Muhammad. Now, why this was kind of significant and in this particular year is the Nation of Islam is not necessarily following classical Islam. Because within the Quran, within Islam, racism is a sin. It's actually spelled out in the Quran that racism is a sin. So Farrakhan's position, based on Elijah Muhammad's position that whites are devils, etc., breaks with classical Islam. And so Wallace, after his father's death, decided, okay, we're going to basically follow classical Islam and renounce a lot of the things that Farrakhan had been talking about and repudiate that and actually return to a more traditional view.
Wallace Muhammad had his own problems.
Yes. Naturally. Yes. So, if you wanted to actually, do further work, it's always interesting looking at religious leaders and their worldviews, because, everything's problematic, can be problematic. May 2nd, South Carolina governor signs a bill to make Martin Luther King's birthday an official state holiday, and South Carolina is the last state to recognize the day as a holiday. Venus Williams beats her sister Serena in semifinals, becomes the first black woman to win the women's title since Althea Gibson did it in the 50s.
She just won yesterday, too.
Serena did, yeah, because Venus is hurt.
Right, she's not.
Yeah.
She's done.
She's done, right. Go Serena.
She's probably going to win it again for how many times, I don't know.
Yeah,
She won Wimbledon like 4 times.
yeah. President-elect George W. Bush announces the appointment of several African Americans to his cabinet: Colin Powell, Secretary of State; Condoleezza Rice, Foreign Policy Advisor; and Dr. Roderick Page as Secretary of Education. So back to the selection. After Reconstruction, during the Civil Rights era, the disenfranchisement tactics included literacy tests, poll taxes, fear, intimidation, closing the polls, losing the voting list, having the polls guarded by law enforcement or vigilantes. All of those things led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, remember, there was a Voting Rights Act of 1865-66, where that in the Constitution that guaranteed blacks the right to vote. However, means of denying them the right to vote, okay, if they're not going to school, how can they read? Right? How can you read to actually vote? How do you know where to vote? Poll tax you have to pay to be able to vote. If you can't make the fee, they did that in Oregon, actually. The poll tax applied to blacks, Chinese, and Hawaiians. Outright fear and intimidation, closing the polls. So when we went to vote by mail, we closed the polls. How many of you actually remember, if you were voting, do you remember voting at polling places?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, so some of us are old enough to remember that and have done that. Little old ladies.
Mr. Harris has voted.
Wow, democracy. All right, so the Voting Rights Act is 65. Even so, the right to vote varied from state to state as part of states' rights. So a criminal record could cause you to lose your right to vote in some states. Okay? You could move to another state and reestablish a right to vote if you knew which state to go to, depending. The Bush boys, W and Jeb, governors in Texas and Florida respectively. Jeb clearly had the brains, in my humble opinion. Might have cooked up a scheme. Notice I didn't say they did. Might have. In many states, voter rolls are a government function. Some states computerize the function but hold it within the state. Some might subcontract it out to a private company on the justification that it's cheaper than having a government agent do it. Right? So that subbing out movement largely comes as, quite frankly, a Republican idea to save money. Smaller government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Who dumped the 60,000 votes in the Gulf of Mexico?
Right. So suppose a state had rules that ex-cons couldn't vote. How would they deal with making sure they couldn't? Well, computers put power in the hands of institutional racists or other ists. So remember what IBM did with Nazi Germany and South Africa. IBM put computing power into the hands of the Nazis and made it possible to carry out the Holocaust. Because Jews vote. Jews pay taxes. if you computerize that, you know exactly where the Jews are. And you can round them up with a handy list. Right? Otherwise, if you're doing it by hand, it would take too long. But a computer gives you power to do that. Same with South Africa. So, IBM did the same for South Africa. So, all ex-cons have names, social security numbers in a computer database. If you've ever been stopped, they run your license. Does a hit come back from NCIC? That's the National Crime Information Computer Database. I have an evil twin.
Doppelganger.
A doppelganger. Now, I got stopped, and basically it was a legitimate equipment failure. This 1959 Type 3 Volkswagen Squareback, when you kill the engine with the lights on at night, it blows a fuse and your taillights go out. So, yeah, you're running without your taillight. Yeah, I know, I have to get that fixed, and you know how easy it is to get a fuse for a 1959 VW Squareback, so whatever. So he runs my license and he said, have you ever been to Chicago? Like O'Hare on the way to DC, that's about it. Well, why? Well, I can't tell. Well, obviously there's a, you got a hit on NCIC. And he kind of does a double, yeah, I know what NCIC is. You know, I'm a drug counselor at Churchill High School, friends with the mayor and the police chief and various cops. So, yeah, I know what NCIC is. So, tell me what it is. Well, there's a Mark Harris, same initial, same birth date, 10 pounds lighter, 2 inches shorter. Well, I can't tell you what it is. Well, obviously this is an armed and dangerous beef, and my ex was sitting, we had the kids in the back, and she said, no, I know him. We've never been to Chicago, so, okay, great. I said, can you does your car, this is an Oregon State Trooper, so they didn't have the computers in the car at the time, run a make on the guy, right? And I just started naming off all the cops I knew, so 2 weeks later, he stops me again because, the lights had blown out again, and he said, oh yeah, it's you. Well, yeah, I saw the guy, it's not you. Thanks. Okay, right. So then I'm getting my stepson an apartment in Idaho, right? 3 years ago. And, for some reason they're running a criminal background check. Okay, credit report, criminal background, whatever, okay, whatever, fine. Well, we can't rent him the apartment using you as a cosigner because of your fraud charge. My what?
Wow.
Oh, you have to call LexisNexis. Okay, so I call LexisNexis. What fraud charge? Oh, we will separate out the Illinois Department of Corrections information from your file. What Illinois Department? How did my file get mixed up? You mean, don't you use social security numbers? I mean, what, you just Mark C. Harris, same birth date, and that's all you did? Not social, not, wow, you guys, that's whack, right? So, computers make mistakes, and in the hands of stupid people, they can really mess up your life. I'm just saying, right? So, back to slide. All ex-cons have names, social security numbers in a computer database. All voters might as well, because they also might have taxes, be employed, have bank accounts, right? Anything that has your social on it, because I've been a victim of identity theft, all they need is certain information and they have access to all your stuff.
What's NCIC stand for again?
National Crime Information Center, basically, something like that. So, what if you subcontracted out the management of a computerized database with the instructions to trim it down? So, you purge ex-cons, but the way databases work, And I'm describing what actually happened. So this isn't, just speculation. This actually happened. Purge ex-cons, purge people with the same name as ex-cons, purge people with the same birthday as ex-cons, purge people with similar names as the ex-cons, different spelling of the same word, last name, first name. Okay? Since most ex-cons in the South tended to be black, because of the practice starting in the 1860s, you could be arrested. Remember, we got this, the 13th Amendment came from the state of Oregon, which made it illegal for black people to be here. So instead of enslaving you, we arrested you, and then we could work you for free, because it's not slavery when you're lawfully convicted of a crime, and in this case in Oregon, the crime was simply being here. In Mississippi, it would be owning land. It might be attempting to use your college degree. All those things could be used to make you a criminal and work you on a chain gang. Right? So the South then, with that pattern, most ex-cons in the South tended to be black, and this has a disproportionate effect on black voters. When you set up a system in which you purge, just starting with the ex-cons, using all those other criteria. So then you get a wider net, and then you basically just simply purge those people from the voters' rolls. Okay, so the result, thousands of people get purged who have no criminal records and at all who were legitimate voters. And those purged tended to be minority and Democratic voters. So in Florida, this is actually what it made it a close race at all. So by the time it got to the hanging chads, we're basically talking about a gap of only a few hundred. If the voters hadn't been purged, there would have been no contest. Bush would have lost. Okay, so Florida was not the only state this happened in. So, while the press focused on hanging chads and recounts, the Supreme Court essentially gave the election to Bush. Now, all this to say, in terms of looking at how, when I say sociostructural violence, when I say type 5, this is major stuff. It might not seem like it affects you, but yeah, it does. So then, devising a counter for it might be useful task, okay? So, quietly, a law got passed enabling the Florida voter poll process to be exported to all other states. Okay? So, rather than think that voting's a waste of time, which is what they want you to think so that you give up, not voting and giving up is what they want you to do. Don't do that. All right? If lying becomes the norm, truth-telling becomes revolutionary. Okay? Isms. Go high-tech, then the response should also be high-tech. Okay? Resistance is the secret of joy. So further timelines. 2001. In January, Representative John Conyers of Michigan reintroduces legislation to create a commission to study the issue of slavery reparations. May 12th, 8 of the original Freedom Riders reenact their 61 bus ride. In 1961, the civil rights protesters rode from Atlanta to Montgomery, stopping facilities designated whites only in order to test the Supreme Court ruling banning racial segregation in public facilities. And of course, 2001, 9/11. There is a study. First of all, I'll tell you about a group that you probably haven't heard of, though I did see it mentioned relatively recently, something like in the last year. It's called Able Danger, and it's a group of civilian and law enforcement and intelligence community workers and assets, and they assess terrorism threats. So among others, they do profiling on who becomes a terrorist. So the study, Sociology and Psychology of Terrorism, reported the findings of the Federal Research Division's research of then current literature written by experts on terrorism inside and outside government. Now, who the Federal Research Division is? CIA. Now, this report was classified. And the graphic you see was taken from its executive summary. It's turned in, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Basically, Condoleezza Rice had to explain after 9/11, because this report got leaked and put on the Library of Congress website where I downloaded it. Why not? My tax dollars, I want to know, right? So, and then I got a call from a friend of mine who was part of the team that put it together. And they said, essentially, all the references are true in terms of the scholarly references, but the people who wrote it, our names have been changed, right? To protect our identity, et cetera, because it was classified, right? So it makes interesting reading because it's talking about who becomes a terrorist and why. All kinds of terrorists. White supremacists, Irish Republican Army, Arabs, everybody. And then basically in the executive summary, who's the most credible threat to the United States, right? So, commissioned in June 1999 by the National Intelligence Council, there's a website link, and delivered in September of 1999. Now, theoretically, a paper copy of this study can be ordered through the Library of Congress at that particular place. I haven't really looked online like I said, I have a copy already, so it's interesting reading.
You can read it now because of the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah. Well, actually, you don't even have to use FOIA, but anyway. The fact of the report's existence was leaked to the media in December of 2001 in response to what did the government know in advance about the 9/11 attacks. Now, I ain't tripping. I ain't one of those truthers that basically say, okay, the government was behind 9/11, yada, yada. I'm not down with that. I don't care. Doesn't matter. The dominant story is what the dominant story is. It's kind of like, was AIDS a bioweapon? Okay, if you think it's a bioweapon, then you think that the government has a cure that they're going to let you have? No. Okay, if they were behind 9/11, you think they're going to leave evidence walking around? No. Don't trip about it. Deal with what you can deal with.
We have enough real threats, right?
Yeah, we have enough
Not
real
gonna make shit
threats.
up.
All right. So the graphic to the right was included in the text of the executive summary of the report. Quote, new breeds of increasingly dangerous religious terrorists emerged in the 1990s. The most dangerous type is the Islamic fundamentalist. A case in point is Ramzi Youssef, who brought together a loosely organized ad hoc group, the so-called Liberation Army, apparently for the sole purpose of carrying out the World Trade Center operation in February of 93. Moreover, by acting independently, the small self-contained cell led by Youssef prevented authorities from linking it to an established terror organization such as its suspected coordinating group, Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, or possible state sponsor. Now, here's the issue with terrorism in particular, all right? If you have a state, okay, so you have civilians, you have an army. Terrorism is the use of deadly force against a civilian population. The rules of war are armies fight armies, and states have armies, right? So terrorism is basically, okay, yeah, you might have collateral damage by your army, but that's not supposed to be necessarily intentional, right? So if you have a group like Al-Qaeda, Irish Republican Army, those are defined as terrorists because they're not going after hard military targets, they're going after civilians intentionally. And since they're not operating from a state, you can't retaliate against Saudi Arabia, even though the majority of the 9/11 hijackers were
Saudi.
And this 93, that was the first.
The first World Trade Center bombing, which caused some damage, but didn't bring down,
That was a blind sheep.
yeah.
Was
Well.
it?
So, if Iran's mullahs or Iraq's Saddam Hussein decide to use terrorists to attack the continental United States, they likely turn to bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is among the Islamic groups recruiting increasingly skilled professionals such as computer and communications technicians, engineers, pharmacists, and physicists, as well as Ukrainian chemists, and biologists, Iraqi chemical weapons experts, and others capable of helping develop WM